Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast, where science meets real-life experience to empower diabetes management. I'm John Pemberton. I've lived with type 1 diabetes since 2008 and have spent nearly 20 years mastering both the science and art of managing it. Through personal experimentation, published research, and my work as a diabetes specialist dietitian, I've gained deep insights into what truly makes a difference. When my son Jude tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies, I realised that all the knowledge in my head was wasted if I couldn't communicate it in a way that was clear, actionable, and easy to come back to. So I built the Glucose Never Lies education programme, a free online resource designed to teach people diabetes management exactly the way I'd want people to understand it if they were looking after my son. After battling a functional motor disorder for many years and recently experiencing a major depressive episode, I was eventually pulled out of that hole by my friends, family, and professionals who helped me get back to being me. That experience taught me the power of giving, and this podcast is my way of giving back. My co-host Louise is a highly experienced diabetes nurse with over 20 years in the field. She brings a wealth of knowledge, and her superpower is making complex diabetes science accessible and practical for everyday life. She is the best diabetes nurse I have ever worked with, and there have been some good ones. Most importantly, she keeps me in check and keeps the podcast on point. So, if you're living with diabetes or supporting someone who is, we want to make things easier, clearer, and importantly, more enjoyable. We hope you enjoy the content. If you do, please share it with those who may like it too. As a disclaimer, the information shared on the Glucose Never Lies podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. While we discuss strategies and insights for diabetes management, this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult your healthcare team before making any changes to your diabetes plan. That done with, let's get into the content. On the fundamentals of the Glucose Never Lies podcast. So when I was talking to Lou on the AID series podcast, we were talking sometimes about things that are technical, and Lou suggested it may be worth doing an episode just to catch everyone up on certain aspects. First of all, simply how to explain or what is diabetes. And then second of all, the importance of glucose going into the portal vein, but insulin from a type 1 diabetes perspective is going into the subcutaneous tissue and not into the portal vein. So we'll discuss what that means and the implications of that. To talk a little bit more about the effect of activity and how that can supercharge insulin, explaining that a little bit more clearly. And then finally, what happens when you have a high fat meal and you get this insulin resistance effect? What is going on? So this podcast will serve as a reference point to come back to occasionally to find out about some of those specifics about what is actually going on in the body. Because if you understand what's going on and you then understand how the glucose is behaving in a certain way, solutions become a lot clearer on why you're implementing them. Within this podcast, there'll be quite a bit of discussion around how things are and how they look, and there'll be a set of comprehensive show notes that go along with it with diagrams to help you just unpick some of those things that you may or may not understand. So first of all, what is diabetes? So the easiest way to think about this is what a good doctor taught me once, the journey of toast. So when you eat toast, which is a carbohydrate, it goes into your mouth, you chew it, goes into your stomach, and then goes into your small intestines. And then when it goes into your small intestines, it gets absorbed, then it goes into a blood vessel called the portal vein. And the portal vein connects the intestine to the liver. So the glucose goes along and goes into the liver. Now, if you don't have type 1 diabetes, you have a pancreas that's sat above the portal vein, and when it senses the glucose level is rising because you've been eating carbohydrate, it will release insulin so that the vast majority of that glucose will get trapped or stored in the liver. And I think of insulin as almost like a transporter. It comes along, it opens the cell door and allows glucose to move from the blood into the cells. So a lot of people think of insulin like a key, and that it unlocks the cell, allows the glucose to move in so you can produce energy. Some of that glucose gets out into the outside of the body, the outside blood supply, and obviously you need insulin there as well, and that will go along to the muscles and the fat cells, open up the doors of those and allow glucose to move in. Now, obviously, if you don't have diabetes, that insulin release is very well regulated. As soon as the glucose level starts to dip down, the insulin production is turned off. As soon as the glucose level starts to go up, the insulin production is ramped up. So obviously with type 1 diabetes, we have an autoimmune destruction of the beta cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. So you go from being able to produce as many keys as you need to very few or not enough, almost as it seems overnight. Doesn't quite happen like overnight, it's generally over a couple of months, but how you experience it is you go from having enough insulin to no insulin very quickly, therefore the glucose level rises, and that's how people then get diagnosed with high glucose levels. So hopefully that explains kind of what generally happens. So obviously with type 1 diabetes, if the insulin is not being produced from the pancreas, you need to give it from the outside, which can be by an insulin pump or by injections. But before we get to that, it's also important to note that there's another way that glucose gets into the bloodstream, and that is the liver stores up glucose when you eat, so that when you're not eating, it can release the glucose steadily in between those times to provide glucose for the rest of the body. And that's really useful to understand. So you've got two ways that glucose goes into the bloodstream. You've got when you eat carbohydrates in general, and with the liver that's got it stored, releases it on a slow, gradual basis, sort of every hour or throughout the 24-hour period. So then when we come to insulin therapy, if you're on injection therapy, you're generally taking a background insulin that you give once or twice a day that provides insulin for a 24-hour coverage. So you can imagine then that is the insulin that is there to look after the glucose that's produced by the liver, because the liver trickles out glucose over a 24-hour period. A long-acting insulin works steadily over 24 hours. If you match your background insulin to your output of glucose from the liver, then in general, your glucose levels will stay fairly steady. Obviously, it's not that simple, but that's the theory. Similarly, if you're on a standard open loop pump, if you've got a basal rate, that is a basal hourly drip of fast-acting insulin, that again can be changed on an hourly basis to match the output of glucose from the liver. So if you think of long-acting insulin or basal insulin to look after the glucose from the liver, and then you've got your bolus, think of bowl of food, as the insulin that you give for a meal, which covers the glucose that's from the carbohydrate in general. So that's kind of what type 1 diabetes is. That's why you take insulin to replace for the thing that is lost, and that really sets the stage for the next few things. So a lot of people will say, when I give my insulin according to how I've been told, I've counted my carbohydrates accurately, I've given the right amount of fast-acting insulin, and I even gave it 15 to 20 minutes before I ate, but yet my glucose level still rises after eating. What's going on there? And that's ultimately because, as I just described, a person without type 1 diabetes puts their insulin directly into the portal vein. So as soon as the carbohydrate is digested, it goes into the portal vein, the insulin is there, most of it gets trapped in the liver. With type 1 diabetes, the insulin goes into the fat tissue, goes into the outer circulation of the blood with only a little bit in the portal vein. So when you eat your carbohydrate foods, only a little bit gets stored in the liver and the vast majority gets into the outer bloodstream, and then the insulin that's there puts it into the muscle cells and the fat cells. So there is a time where that glucose level rises higher than if you didn't have diabetes. And that can be very, very frustrating as a person with type 1 diabetes, because you've done everything quote unquote right, that you're still getting these post-meal spikes. And that is particularly happens after things that are carbohydrate only generally. So breakfast cereals are pretty much the worst for that, because you're most resistant to insulin in the morning. You throw in a meal that gets digested very quickly, and that's why you get post-meal spikes. So as long as you understand the insulin that you're giving is going from the outside and doesn't go directly into the portal vein, that's very important to remember as we move forward with the further information that we receive, because in an ideal world, you'd want the insulin going into the portal vein, but that doesn't happen. So you're still going to be getting high levels after eating. And that's why it's important, if possible, to give your fast-acting insulin for food 15 to 20 minutes before, to get it in the bloodstream ready to capture the glucose from the food, and also to have a little bit more insulin in the portal vein to capture some more in the liver. So hopefully that explains some of the differences between having type 1 diabetes and not, and why you need to give your insulin before time. And then Louise also mentioned it's important to understand how does activity supercharge the insulin? What do you mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is when you put the insulin, as we just described, into the fat tissue, one of the biggest things that slows the action of it down is it takes a while for it to go into the fat tissue and then get absorbed into the blood. And the speed of that absorption is a lot due to the blood delivery to that skin. So if you think if you're active, it pumps the blood more towards your skin so you can lose heat out of there, and at the same time then as the blood goes there, it sucks more of insulin out of your fat tissue. So the more you move, the better the blood flow to your skin, the faster the absorption of the insulin that you've taken. So that's one way that it increases the speed of it being into your bloodstream, which is helpful. But what's this supercharging effect? What does that mean? Well, the second thing is if you're pumping the blood to your skin, you're also pumping the blood to your muscles, which means that the insulin that is in the blood is actually delivered to the muscles faster, therefore it can work faster than it could before. So instead of the insulin maybe taking 2 hours to peak, you can get it to peak faster at an hour or 90 minutes by putting in some activity, because you're spreading it to, not only are you absorbing it faster, you're pushing it to the muscles. And then finally, another reason why pound for pound you get more out of the insulin that you've given when you're active is people with type 1 diabetes, the main way that they get rid of or degrade insulin is by the kidneys. So if you start doing activity, what you will find is more blood is pumped to the muscles, less is pumped to the kidneys, which means less insulin is broken down by the kidneys before it has a chance to get used by the muscles. So it makes the insulin even stronger pound for pound. So the value of doing 10 to 15 minutes of walking or moving after eating and giving insulin is how you supercharge the insulin to actually improve how it works and keep those post-meal highs covered. And what I will talk about in a future podcast, which is being taught now, is if you're high in between meals and you've got bolus insulin on board, taking a walk or moving around for 15 minutes is the best way to supercharge that insulin that's on board to drop the glucose level by 2. So 15 minutes drops the glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre, or if you're in milligrams per deciliter, 15 minutes will drop you by 40 milligrams per deciliter. If you remember that rule, if you're above 10 or 180 milligrams per deciliter, 15 minutes drops you by 2, or 15 minutes drops you by 40. And that's the reason why that activity is supercharging the insulin. And then the final bit on this is thinking about what happens when you have high-fat meals. Well, first of all, the high-fat meal slows down the food leaving your stomach, so the glucose doesn't rise as quick. And sometimes if you give the insulin ahead of time, you go low first. But the major problem is later on, as that carbohydrate then leaves the stomach, not only is there generally not enough insulin around, you also have another effect of insulin resistance from the high fat level. So this is where you're going to have to think about insulin, as fat as a tadpole, which might sound really strange, but when you see the diagram, you'll see it. So think of a tadpole with 3 little sort of tails coming off it. And that is what a fatty acid is. It's a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached to it. So they're swimming along in your portal vein once you've eaten a high-fat meal. And when they go into your liver, they get slightly metabolized and go into your liver cells. But when they go into your liver cells, they become a tadpole with not 3 tails, but 2 tails. And that's called a diacylglycerol. So the reason why I'm telling you about this is these diacylglycerols, when they're in your liver cells, what they actually do is they go towards the surface of the cell and they disrupt the insulin signaling. And they also do that within the muscles as well. So if you can think you've had a high-fat meal, there's loads of these fatty acid tadpoles swimming around. Some of them get into your liver, some of them get into your muscle cells, and when they get broken down into a diacylglycerol, a tadpole with 2 little tails, they actually go to the surface of the cell and they disrupt how insulin works. So even if you might think you have enough insulin to cover the effect of the carbohydrate, this diacylglycerol effect, this tadpole with 2 tails effect, is essentially stopping the insulin work as effectively. So that means the insulin that you thought would be enough for that meal isn't, and the glucose level starts to rise because the glucose can't get transported from the blood into the cells. So your options there are you have to increase the amount of insulin that you use, or alternatively, you can burn some of those tadpoles, those diacylglycerols, if you start moving your backside. So the more active you are, the more of those diacylglycerols you burn in the cell, the less of the insulin resistance effect there is. So if you're wondering, God, when I have a pizza, I always go high and I stay high all night. Well, what do you do after a pizza at nighttime? You don't do any movement and you don't give enough insulin. So obviously you're going to stay high, and you're going to stay high for a long period of time, unless you give extra insulin to cover that. And we'll obviously covered some of that in the automated insulin delivery series, and we will in the future CGM series. So what I want you to take away from this is insulin is like a transporter, or works like a key at moving glucose from the blood into the cells. To understand that people with type 1 diabetes do not have enough insulin in the portal vein. It's too much out in the periphery, in the blood in the periphery. The effect of activity is to supercharge insulin, and you can use that to stop post-meal highs by doing 10 to 15 minutes movement after eating, or if you're high after eating, 15 minutes will drop the glucose level by 2 or 40 milligrams per deciliter. And then finally, after a high-fat meal, you're going to get this insulin resistance from this tadpole with 2 tails rather than 3, this diacylglycerol effect, which go inside the liver cells and the muscle cells, and they cause insulin resistance because they stop the insulin working as well. So hopefully those principles of those things will guide you through a lot of the discussions that we have, because all the strategies that we discuss are generally trying to stop post-meal highs or stop insulin resistance from high-fat meals or harnessing activity to improve glucose control. So if you understand what's going on in the background, you'll be more likely to understand why it works and hopefully to put those into practice. So I'm hoping that has been helpful for you to kind of put some principles and the context. The show notes will have some nice pictures to walk you through this along with my description in the show notes. And yeah, hopefully you're going to find that helpful. And in the next podcast, we're actually going to talk a lot more about this effect of activity to improve time in range. So this activity snacking to improve time in range. So I'll see you in the next podcast.